This is Drewbian. He has been the community manager of Clash Royale since October of 2017, and as of recently, he has been the face of countless controversies revolving around Clash Royale and the changes that have occurred in the name of morphing the game into a cash grab. A person who was once thought to fight on the side of the community, especially regarding balance changes, feedbacks for updates as well as community ideas, has recently turned their back on the community itself, stating that they're no longer getting the feedback from the top sources, Reddit and Twitter, implying that they're ignoring the 92% and majority of people who hold criticism in favour of the 8% who will stroke Drewbian's ego. Once thought of as a respectable community manager, Drewbian's reputation has faced a steep decline thanks to recent updates that have occurred in Clash Royale and his lackluster ability to fight for the community. Instead, he chooses to endorse these updates and let off cryptic phrases such as "they're as transparent as I am allowed to be" in response to his rather short-sighted replies to the community on social networking platforms. But how did this come to be? How did Drewbian, a once respected figurehead inside of Clash Royale and even Supercell's fanbase, fall from grace whilst transforming his career into nothing more than a laughingstock? It's time to answer this question within Drewbian, Clash Royale's living reckoning. On October of 2017, Supercell announced via its LinkedIn page that it had hired a new community manager to fill a spot that had been left vacated for some time. Let it be known that Clash Royale has more than one community manager, with Seth coming to mind as one of the community managers who has been at the face of Clash Royale some time, albeit with sporadic activity considering Supercell is not the most transparent company in the world, as to be expected. It is truly unknown when Drew started having an impact on the game's internal development, considering his face only emerged thanks to TV Royale, which has been hosted on and off since Clash Royale began its journey as a free-to-play adventure that was created as a semi-spin-off of a concept the developer came up with for Clash of Clans. However, it could be neatly estimated based on what happened during Clan Wars 2.0 that this is where his starting point of influence happened to be. Before this point, Drew is believed to have been in charge of taking most of the community feedback as well as responding to it, a menial consideration if you will. Every idea that went through the community often went through Drew's mind, who presumably then suggested it to the developers if it met their criteria for what makes a good idea for Clash Royale. I'm going to be honest with you, with as much research as I've done, this area of Drew's career somewhat remains a mystery, presumably because Supercell wasn't so eager to have him as the face of the community up until later down the line, with his influence steadily growing behind closed curtains the more his experience with Clash Royale improved. I know for sure he made one of his first appearances inside the video Clash Royale League World Finals Hype, which is where he accompanied Seth to talk about the Clash Royale League World Finals, as the title implies. I do believe Drew has made some sporadic appearances before this point, but it is believed to be one of the most prominent points in which he starred. The upload date of November of 2018, which also lines up somewhat perfectly with him being with Supercell for a year, which is where I assumed he further learned the ropes of how to be a community manager, most likely by managing things behind the scenes such as balancing updates, especially for CWL. It's when its competition value was at its highest and the content updates were crazy alongside necessary. It is believed sometime in 2019 is when Drew ended up becoming more influential behind the scenes, taking up the mantle to become one of the three primary community managers of the time, accompanying Seth as one of those community managers. Of course, each one of these community managers had their own respective roles. It is believed Seth at the time was the communicator of the updates that were coming out, whilst Drew was the one who took all the community feedback, consider it inside of his mind, and then passed that information along to developers for consideration. Therefore, this resulted in possibly one of the most catastrophic ideas being formulated within 2019, partially thanks to Drew's meddling mind, and that happened to be Clan Wars 2.0. Clan Wars 2.0 was designed to take Clan Wars 1.0, which was developed as a more engaging response to the clan chess system, and make it better. But how did this make the game better exactly? By imposing a month-long war system, the amount of times the word boat was mentioned by multiple Supercell staff in the initial announcement videos for this update was insane, and in the long run, it ended up severely impacting the amount of time people spent inside the Clan Wars, considering this is where the game began to show obvious symptoms of going down a pay-to-win route. So nice one, Drew. A little recap for those of you who didn't really care much for Clan Wars 2.0, it goes a little something like this. You essentially play in the hopes of completing challenges, whether they be player versus environment challenges or something a little more direct. The whole idea of it hinges on the fact that you've got a high level cards that you can play to beat these challenges. The mentality of it being primarily done for the sake of driving up profits arose to considering one of the big advantages you could gain from playing Clan Wars 2.0 was from having high level cards. After a month, many people realised how truly overhyped this update was and how it didn't help that Drew is one of the main faces that not only explained this update but also gave community responses as to why it replaced Clan Wars 1.0. He has later gone in recent statements saying that he hopes hopes to rectify the issues with Clan Wars 2.0 and the reworks to it, but this is something that you'll get used to with Drew. He's filled with a lot of empty promises. If I can recall correctly, Drew even told people right from the very beginning that there will be adjustments to this system to make it much more enjoyable and engaging. Believe it or not, one of the best parts about the original Clan Wars was the fact you'd often have to work with randomized decks, and it encouraged teamwork all in the name of figuring out which deck was appropriate for the type of challenge they had to complete. Plus, Clan Wars was about optimization, teamwork, efficiency and bonding. All of those aspects were eradicated for a good majority of players once Clan Wars 2.0 came out, as there had become one primary objective, and that was for Clash Royale to begin raking in money with those who not only climbed the ladder through matchmaking, but also poured their time into Clan Wars in the hopes that people would level up their cards via purchasing chests, of which those chests had to be bought with gems, which are sourced from the in-game marketplace. Although Drew cannot be solely faulted for this update, it is, to a degree, his mistake for giving off empty promises to those once the update released and for reacting incorrectly to feedback. Almost as if he was offended by the amount of people who didn't like the idea of people abusing time zones near the end of the boat races to push their boats forward to win the round. The only real update that was added to Clan Wars 2.0 ever since its implementation was the promise that boats would be locked in place to prevent people exploiting time zones and for it to be fair, as well as some complementary reward balancing, because why not? But still, having to wait a good solid month for straight up warring against mostly a player versus environment setting for those juicy rewards as opposed to the bland wars was exhausting, and honestly it was tiring for many people who were big into Clash Royale at the time. There was an update in 2020 that improved some of the aspects of Clan Wars 2.0, but it was more or less a false incentive for people to still have faith in the system, as opposed to it fixing anything, such as giving double fame and repair points for the last 3 days of the war. You'd think as a community manager, one of the more significant ones, as it's clear that Drew has the largest understanding of the game from the 3 primary figureheads of the game, giving back clear feedback from the community that tells them that they do not enjoy this update and that it needs to be altered to some degree is kind of, I don't know, your job. To be the voice of the community internally and externally. Drew, from what I know, is one of the only people who works on the front end of the Clash Royale development team, basically the people who communicate directly to the community as opposed to indirectly through patch notes, who can actually understand the inner workings of the game as if he were a developer himself. The fact that he really refused to do much about this update was where this whole schism began amidst the Clash Royale community. It was slow, almost as if a volcano was gently rumbling in preparation for a later eruption. Although the magma and the seas were calm for a while throughout 2020, considering nothing significant happened other than maintenance breaks, as I am sure everyone here remembers that year with not so fond memories. To many this was considered a mere one-off at the time, but upon the entry of 2021 into the minds of many, it became clear that this was not just a one-off incident, but it was instead a pattern that was beginning to emerge, not only with Drew becoming increasingly limp regarding his fight for the Clash Royale community, but also the internal decisions that were being made, most likely with his voice lending a hand, that slowly been leading Clash Royale down a more pay-to-win path. At the conclusion of March 2021, Clash Royale's development team added magic items to the game with the approval of the rest of the community managers. I will admit the implementation of magic items was slightly messy to say the least. Of course, they enabled you to finally pick what card you wish to level up as opposed to randomly rolling the dice inside of the chest, but even so, it added another random variable in the form of unlocking common, rare, epic or legendary magic cards or wild cards that could be used to upgrade your cards inside of your deck. At first, I saw no evil within this update, and Drew actually handled himself quite well with responding to some of the community's concerns regarding everything. Of course, there were items such as a book of cards, which was sold alongside a massive pack when the update went live because it was an easy way for the Clash Royale development team to make money, but that seems quite innocent by itself, right? Well, unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way. An update intended to add an amount of balance in the game actually gave people more of an incentive to buy these packs that included these magic items alongside chests, which were slowly but surely being phased out in favour of these packs so that they could level up a certain deck and stomp on their opponents without any issue. This is a fundamental point in Clash Royale's history, where the game began to shift from actually being competitively viable to starting to show signs of being paid to win. And what did Drew do about this? Honestly, not anything productive, and well, it's not like anyone saw this coming at the time, except for the few who wore tinfoil hats religiously whilst foretelling the eventual pit that this game would end up falling into. One of the most sought after items inside of this update, and one that remained mostly exclusive to the past Royale or for the packs inside of the shops for a long long time happened to be the magic coin. I feel like Drew really should have picked up on the fact that it would be extremely overpowered to skip an entire level with just one item, and would have shifted the measure to some degree, making the game feel like as if it were more a competition between who had the largest wallets as opposed to who actually had the highest level of skill. From what I know, very few free-to-play players were able to breeze through the slog that happened to be upgrading cars with gold, which could often take months or even years to max out one singular deck from the current level 12 to level 13, a tedious task in of itself. Either way, this update ended up dropping. Some people were upset, some people were enraged that Drew did nothing to stop this, but he wasn't remaining undercover at the time considering his response to the community wasn't all too vigorous. You'd think Clash Royale's development team would have learned a somewhat sensible lesson about favouring the pay-to-win player base, that maybe level 13 with these magic items would have been the limit and there wouldn't be any form of magic mishap that would have taken place, right? Well, you'd be wrong considering in October of 2021, the same year may I add, they not only added champions to the game in the form of the Golden Knight and the Archer Queen, they also took it upon themselves to add level 14. At the time, it was admittedly a welcome change for the few at the top who had been stuck with max level cars at the same time, but there came an influx of outrage directed at the community managers for refusing to do anything about the current state of the game. Drew, as a community manager, quite frankly had a duty to communicate to the players that these things were going to happen and to prepare for them, to welcome these changes with open arms or to allow some feedback beforehand. But this update came as a slight surprise, and from what I know, barely anything was tweaked between the announcement of this update and the release of it. It's almost as if over time, Drew and well, the community managers in general for Clash Royale have become a little more spineless and willing to let the developers cause mayhem. And though I don't have the most power in the world, I am very much aware of this as they are community managers. They manage the community, not the game development itself, but their job also includes giving feedback from the community to give to the developers. It seemed as if in late 2021, this feedback almost entirely stopped and the community managers alongside developers dug their heads into the sand. To be fair to them, I don't entirely fault them for doing this. 2021 was arguably one of the worst years for Clash Royale. Despite it receiving two massive content updates, the previous year of 2020 had turned away many heads, and it's clear that as for now, the community wasn't the focus, but that making profits and bringing people back was for the Clash Royale development team. At the time, I was under the assumption that this would be temporary, especially with the addition of champions, which I will add were extremely overpowered in the first month of their launch. Sure, there were balancing changes, but that didn't stop people from viewing them as being heavily overpowered, as these are two champions that came out at the beginning in the form of the Golden Knight and the Archer Queen. There were countless cries from the community and even remarks from content creators that the Archer Queen and Golden Knight were outrageously overpowered, although they eventually received the nerfs that they required, albeit that came after Supercell and Clash Royale had a solid amount of people and packs sold to those who were convinced that these cards had merit, in the form of them being overpowered and being worthy enough to spend their money on those aforementioned champions, therefore milking the community out of their stipends once again. One more event that made this whole champion clumsiness and mismanagement of magic items even worse was the addition of the Mighty Miner. At the very beginning of the update, he was insanely overpowered. He could basically tear through structures. Although easily counterable, his ability to drop down and place a bomb in his place still is an issue that's hard to counter to this very day, as he's essentially a gold mine for anyone wishing to receive a positive elixir trade. Not only that, people could also believe that he's profiting off the fact that Brerad is saying stuff like nerf miner, and then they proceed to add Mighty Miner into the game, serving as community appeasement if you will. You would think Supercell, Clash Royale and Drew, as one of the most significant community managers, who, may I remind you, has significant access to data as well as intricate understanding of the game, would try to balance this card, but nope. It is still able to churn through towers to this very day without having much done. I thought this game was about balancing, but clearly not, considering there used to be a massive variety of decks able to be used, even touted by Supercell themselves, and a lot of decks nowadays used in the top ladder happens to revolve around champions or evolutions. However, we're not at the point where we discuss the impact of evolutions just yet. The addition of these three champions was meta shifting, but not in the sense that should be revered and celebrated quite that many game updates. It was heavily upsetting to those who had played the game without spending any money or by investing purely in the Clash Royale. It took a tremendous amount of effort to unlock these champions, and even if you had them in the deck, the unfair matchmaking calculations would lead to you facing them against people with max level champions, of which was now level 14 thanks to the fact that this game was starting to lose control of its greed. That's one thing I completely brushed over, level 14. I will admit, I am one of those people who felt as if this change was in the works for years, and I don't necessarily have a problem with the update in general. It was the handling of the development team and Drew's lack of transparency with the Clash Royale community that massively wounded only the impact of this update, other than giving people who had hoarded gold or yet again spent money a momentary advantage for Clash Royale and over other players. Gold is one of those things that has become a permanent mainstay in Clash Royale, and it has led to a lot of bottlenecked amidst the community throughout the years. Many people were expecting level 14 to be achievable with relative ease, but upon seeing some of the prices for level 14 cards, a lot of people began to question where the linear metrics had come from to actually level up their cards in a justifiable manner. It may have been achievable for many, but it still felt as if the price to level up your card from level 13 to level 14 wasn't to set an illusion of challenge, but to in fact incentivize you to spend more money converting gems to gold, or more realistically, purchasing the pass royale. Yet, if we really want to discuss the blatant neglect of prices, the lack of transparency Drew alongside the rest of the Clash Royale development team was given to the community, as well as the incentive and drive for profits that carries the backbone of Clash Royale's modern morals, we must move our discussion regarding two controversial cards that released in the third quarter of 2022, and how they began to demonstrate the true greed and lack of morals that seeped from the cracks within Clash Royale's development team. On the 22nd of October 2022, Clash Royale received arguably the most overpowered cards in its history in the form of the Monk and the Phoenix. You'd think they would have gone over this in testing, that Drew, any community manager or developer would have realised these cards were unfathomably balanced during the testing phase, but nope. The immense amount of circusry that went into this update will put any form of clowns wishing to entertain audience to shame, as the community immediately called upon Drew amidst others to nerf these cards to oblivion, considering Monk was able to straight up take towers without much intervention, and the Phoenix, alongside its ability to respawn via an egg, put the reproductive capacity of Genghis Khan's seed to shame. What do I mean by that? Countering the Phoenix with a card or a combination of cards that would net a positive elixir trade was virtually impossible. Unlocking the card was more or less preserved for those who had the gems to spend money on chests, as well as the pass royale, further overshadowing the free-to-play players who enjoyed Clash Royale in the process. As one of the only cards people in the upper trophy leagues had yet to unlock, managing to secure the Phoenix as a playable card was exceptionally difficult, and leveling up without the use of wild cards was even more torturous. This update in particular really set a damning precedent for the rest of Clash Royale's upcoming updates, considering these cards took more time to be nerfed than Master Uge walking up a flight of stairs, going on to further show through the outlets of many content creators that these cards were the equivalent of paying not only to play them but also to level them up. The lack of ability to strongly nerf them in an efficient manner led to one huge conclusion in this update, that Clash Royale was taking the path of becoming a truly pay-to-win game. I'd like to make it clear now that Clash Royale has always been inherently pay-to-win to some extent. It doesn't matter who you ask. The fact that the game's progression system was limited for so long until the addition of Trophy Road, the King's Chest alongside the fabled Path of Legends, of which these were only minor bumps towards the comparison of those unlockables pay-to-win players held, the aforementioned limitation and continuation further harboured the pay-to-win mindset, that being a skill was only a small part of Clash Royale, and that paying to progress along the ladder was the ultimate solution. Yet, there was always a balance. There was always a variety of cards you could use that didn't have direct counters. They weren't overpowered or broken cards, and if they were, they would be rectified quickly through a patch. These two cards, Monk and Phoenix, were the first new cards added since champions were added to the game in the prior year. You'd think your jobs as game developers, community managers such as Drew, even the marketing team, would have a basic responsibility to cater to the needs of the community. Yet this is when that split truly emerged, and it went from catering to the whole community to only a set amount of community members. So, how many members of the community are being served then, you may ask? Well, according to Drew, they don't take negative feedback from any social media seriously and only fixate on the numbers, regardless of how small they are in the comparisons, as per the reply to this Twitter user, which is where Drew snarkily responds to someone citing the fact that nobody enjoys the evolution update, and he weakly responds with the equivalent of, well, 8% of people do. How much of an ignorant bigot could you be when it comes to your game's community and its core and the fact that it's slowly rotting away? Anyways, back to Monk and Phoenix for a second. Their slowness regarding a nerf led to a lot of people purchasing an abhorrent amount of gems in the hopes of unlocking not only Monk but also Phoenix as playable cards, with the even fainter hope of being able to level them up the same day or later down the line. I still remember watching B-Rad's spending spree video regarding the release of Monk and Phoenix, and I honestly pity his wallet for needing to empty itself that much for just 2 cards. Like, does anyone out there remember when seeing cards added to the game wasn't something you had to sacrifice your soul to in hopes of receiving, but instead it was something that was added to the game every other month alongside basically weekly balance patches that stabilized the game. The amount of laziness the development team combined ended up showing off thanks to these decisions was truly astounding. Eventually, and I mean that this took a good month to 2 months to fully quell the fire that happened to involve those outraged at the addition of Monk and Phoenix, those 2 cards received the balance patch that everyone and their close relatives were looking for. Phoenix's egg and reproductive abilities was nerfed significantly, and Monk could no longer kill troops as efficiently, as there was a tremendous uptick and the amount of damage that could be inflicted upon him by enemy troops. How did this slip by those testing up Monk and Phoenix behind the scenes? You know, the literal quality assurance team that Clash Royale relies upon to ensure that everything works properly? History, quite frankly, declines to make an answer, although various theories can be raised into the air. Does anyone remember 2020 and how there were a slew of maintenance updates and patches that were mainly added and patched minor things inside of the game, primarily thanks to the fact that Supercell's working capacity was hindered thanks to the events of that year, as we all know about? This is just my theory and therefore it is quite questionable, but I think they personally discovered that they can put an extremely insignificant amount of effort into maintaining the game with small patches, promises and bug fixes which patch out everything whilst letting the game grow during this time. Of course, thanks to everyone being locked away that year, that led to everyone basically trying out Clash Royale, especially thanks to the fact that Supercell was running advertisements for the game on YouTube alongside other social media such as TikTok and Instagram at the time to keep the game afloat. The one remarkable update that happened this year happened to be slight improvements to the Clan War system as well as the different cycles for the past Royale being changed. Supercell discovered that it could rely on the aesthetic of a new season to coerce people into believing that the game was being freshly updated with new content, when in reality, that content primarily catered to the pay-to-win audience, and it led to the cultivation of a slightly different portion of the community, a part of the community that Drew alongside the rest of the Clash Royale developers could exploit, manage and oversee. I've only mentioned Drew's name in passing because I never wanted to give away the obvious. Through explaining 3 out of 4 chapters in this video, I am sure your mind has come to the same conclusion as my own, and that's the fact that Drew, out of all the staff members on the Clash Royale's development and maintenance team, doesn't actually do anything. He's nothing more than a showman for the circus that Clash Royale operates, a figurehead if you will. In the past 2 years, this individual has done absolutely nothing to benefit the community, and I feel like the Monk and Phoenix update truly proves that when it comes to being bombarded with complaints from Reddit, Twitter, even Instagram regarding how overpowered Monk and Phoenix was at the time. Although it was dumb fun for content creators, his assumption is the fact that your average player has the same budget as a content creator to spend money willingly on the game. It really does make you wonder, is he doing nothing thanks to laziness, or is he doing nothing to benefit the Clash Royale developer themselves? Is he being silenced? Is he unable to remain transparent with the community, or was this his intention the entire time? To become the poster boy of the circusry that Clash Royale as a game has morphed into? To truly answer that question, we must delve into our last chapter, which will examine not only evolution and level 15, the updates themselves, but the cascading avalanche that has followed him into the present, in part thanks to this update, but also his immense arrogance accompanied by his ignorance. At last, we land in the present. After a journey that has taken us through the gentle decline of Clash Royale as well as the increasing amount of laziness Drew has expressed in his role as community manager, this is where everything seemingly falls apart. There have been countless videos made about level 15 evolutions, myself included. I think the sentiment that this update is awful persists dramatically amidst you all, so I won't bore you by parroting the same information once more. Instead, I'll be examining Drew's reaction to the criticism he has received regarding this update and how he's trying to spin the narrative that this update can be negotiated with, in spite of the blatant tomfoolery that comes with the recently released Evolved Knight and how that card can tank 2 sparky shots whilst on the move. His responses in the past months have been scarce considering Supercell has been on vacation, but when the update came out and the month afterwards, his responses to people were ludicrous. First of all, although not directly linked to this conversation, I'd like to note that Drew has already attempted to butter up the community by promising to this Twitter user that Clan Wars would be improved in response to them asking about the devs improving areas of the game that people actually care about. I'm sure if you followed this video this far already, you'll know this is nothing more than an act of appeasement, something that was quite common for Drew during his earlier days duties as community manager before taking a more ignorant role and approach to things. Instead of asking for potential suggestions or asking what the community cared about thanks to this tweet, he instead thought it would be a grand idea to just emptily promise that clan wars will be improved, regardless of what the community says or how they react to it. By improvement, he probably means making the clan war system even more of a slog that can be profited off. Now, onto a second response that was made before this update came out and demonstrates Drew's slight snarkiness. I am aware that the user mentioned his tweet was not criticizing developers correctly, but I am sure that your reaction to such criticism and rage shouldn't be to sarcastically make remarks about it on Twitter and instead look deeper into the motivation behind it. The motivation being that level 15 potentially being added to the game at the time of this tweet and the discontent behind it being added to the game was already brewing. The fact that this tweet was made all the way back in February and the rest of the Clash Royale development team had months to listen to the community to reverse the trajectory of this update as well as to ensure that the game was fairly balanced for all to enjoy it, but instead it seems as if they've developed a rather steadfast attitude of digging their head into the sand regarding any form of criticism whilst pretending that the game is fine. Oh, speaking of which, Drew loves his data and his unlabeled graphs. You can't go more than 30 seconds examining his responses without seeing some form of remark that relates to data being the core aspect of his judgment. He claims that data isn't everything, then cites an unmarked graph that doesn't really show anything in the long run without any integers on screen. There's just a weird line with a green and red line stuck through it. Like, your job is to be transparent with the community, but this means absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. It was supposedly meant to be a reflection of the fact that this game was getting more popular during 2022 in spite of the lack of recent quality updates aside from champions, and is quite old, but the relationship with data seems to be a justification for Drew's continued ignorance against the community. He even ended up making a thread that essentially went on to tell people that he considers data as one of the input metrics, but he also considers a community reaction to everything whilst further contradicting himself whenever someone mentions a community reaction isn't positive. He just ends up using the data he has at his disposal to defend himself, which is ridiculous. Imagine being a literal community manager and your job is to quite literally cater to the community, only to end up ignoring them for the 8% of people who are willing to stroke your ego. This gets worse, by the way. I'm sure everyone remembers when B-Rad put out his infamous video basically 2 months ago regarding the matter, right? Drew ended up over-exaggerating the situation massively by claiming it was personally insulting to have B-Rad act out like that. What does acting out mean, you may be asking yourself? What acting out means in Drew books is the fact that he was probably expecting B-Rad to keep his private opinion under wraps as opposed to voicing his disdain for the update through the community, which has made Drew's job increasingly harder thanks to the fact his ego can't get stroked for managing the game for a good 5 years relatively decently. That's all Drew's career has turned into at this point. He barely takes feedback seriously and disproves any form of legitimate sources hearsay or uses some other form of scapegoat to make himself believe that he's doing a good job, stroking your ego this immensely whilst being a community manager for a game that is severely under threat from using its balance, as well as a good majority of those who are simply too poor to afford paying for the items of any variety, is unfathomably foolish. Drew is not only risking his own credibility by acting this arrogantly and ignorantly, he also threatens the credibility of the Clash Royale development team and even Supercell to some degree. I am not saying he should be fired, but I feel like the new community manager that has recently been hired to further sort out the problems within the game should take a more direct approach to the situation as opposed to letting Drew take the wheel, as it's clear that his incompetence only led Clash Royale down a slippery slope regarding people leaving the game and hating it. I know full well if this video ever gets shown to him, he put out some form of graph that will try and prove the fact that this game is actually doing really well as opposed to what many people think, and that the game is raking record amounts of revenue. Gee, I wonder how that's happening when you've quite literally monopolised pay-to-win player base into feeding you more money, whilst people are intermittently returning for a week only to drop the game again after realising the state that it's in. Drew's treatment of the game and of the community has been, for lack of a better term, disgusting. The amount of effort this individual has put into attempting to refute or invalidate the community's feedback by claiming that it's hyperbole is exceptional and really goes to show how little he or the rest of the Clash Royale management team, for that matter, truly care for the game. Whether it be his ability to prioritise data before the community he manages, to have a great deal of understanding for the game he's managing the community of, only to ignore that community, or the fact he hasn't even been bothered to promise people that there will be balancing updates is completely outrageous. One more thing that puts the cherry on top of this cake filled with corruption is the fact that one of his main promises when it comes to level 15 was the fact that there wouldn't be a requirement for many people to need gold anymore to upgrade their cards. To many this was seen as a relief to them, considering gold was a bottleneck for them, and being able to convert their unused cards into wild cards sounds like a good idea at the time, up until you realise the conversion rate is absolute bogus, and the fact that they're only selling an immense amount of elite wild cards for a ludicrous amount of money only goes to further show that this app was not built for the community. It was built for profit and to line the pockets of those inside of Clash Royale's collective development team. Convincing people of one promise only to deliver another is as the epitome of what you shouldn't be doing as a community manager. Or for a game for that matter. Sure, things happen, game development is complicated, I've been in those shoes before myself, but proceeding to completely gaslight your community into believing that you never made any form of promise despite the fact that it was clearly touted that level 15 would be easy to achieve and the evolution shards would be a complete pay to win fest is shambolic. The only way you can earn evolution shards is through buying them, by getting immensely lucky through taking months of your time to grind out the game or by purchasing the Clash Royale. There is no longer a viable option for free to play players. Drew, alongside the entirety of the Clash Royale development team, has killed free to play for many top players, and will continue to silence those that disagree with him whilst claiming that it's dissent or extremely ungrateful thanks to the fact that Clash Royale already offers itself for free. An absolutely foul policy that, irregardless of those who steer the ground vessel that happens to be Clash Royale, will ensure that an iceberg will crash into that vessel and pose a threat, most likely sooner rather than later. Although there has been a lot of negativity revolving around Drew, it is important to remember that Drew is not the sole individual that is responsible for the maintenance of the game. Sure, his opinions and his brazen responses to people are unhelpful to say the least, but he's not the only one who is responsible for this game's downfall. This game's downfall and Drew being Clash Royale's living reckoning is mainly attributed to the fact that the developers behind the scenes believe that this is the greatest decision to be made, to completely milk the player base dry whilst cultivating a small sect of players who will buy basically anything the game has to offer, regardless of the morals held behind it or the price tag. The reason why Drew was the target of this video as opposed to the entire Clash Royale development team, it's because he's the main person you interact with on social media for any form of answer, justification or conclusion to any of this. He's the individual who must uphold transparency for the sake of the community as opposed to shutting himself in and remaining opaque, at least under the right conditions. This video has been made to highlight the blatant lack of transparency that Drew alongside the rest of the Clash Royale development team has held since the tail end of 2019, which is when the game's internal workings began to grow into a circus filled with clowns as opposed to anything that could be taken seriously. I have hope that one way or another, Clash Royale will eventually make a turnaround and make massive improvements, quite like Brawl Stars has ever since the introduction of Star Road. As for now, those brave enough to continue wading the waves must wander through treacherous waters and sight obscuring storms in regard to the journey that this presently crumbling game has to offer. This has been Nadevar and this has been Drewbian, Clash Royale's living reckoning.